Okay, so today I'm going to review The Godfather. This is the first in my series of reviewing my favorite films. I posted a video yesterday in which I was explaining the series. I'll link to that video down below. But yeah, basically I'm going to rewatch all of my kind of top favorite films and then do video reviews on them. Something I implied in the video yesterday, but maybe didn't state clearly, is I anticipate these reviews being a bit of a mess in that I'm just going to have tons of thoughts on them, and because these are unscripted, this review is probably going to be incoherent and jumping all over the place. And apologies in advance for that, but I just at this point do not have a way to kind of sort out my thoughts into anything resembling a coherent structure without spending loads of time on this. And time is always a factor, isn't it? So hopefully this will at least get some interesting thoughts out there, but otherwise nobody's under any obligation to watch this. Okay, so yeah, my history with this film. I guess I'll start out with my history with this film. This is one of those classic films that you always hear about everywhere, right? So many references to it, so many parodies of it. In addition to that, I had a high school social studies teacher who was a big fan of this film and always used to kind of talk about this film or make references to it, which really got me interested in seeing it. Now, of course, as kind of a teenage boy, you don't need much incentive to want to see this film, right? Like, you know, a violent film about a mafia and a gang war, like, that sounded quite interesting to me just on the face of it, even without all these kind of critical recommendations. But, you know, I was interested in classic films as a young person. I kind of wanted to kind of see what all the fuss was about behind these films. I did something which was which was not good. I regret doing it, kind of, in which I went online and I kind of read the plot summary before I even saw the movie. I shouldn't have done that, but I can't blame myself entirely. I was curious, and everyone was talking about this movie, and this was back in the 90s, so the internet was in its infancy back then. There wasn't Wikipedia, but there was, I think we had the Prodigy internet service subscription, if anyone remembers that from the 90s. And they had a database of kind of classic films and reviews. And it wasn't like Wikipedia where there was a short little plot summary. It was like a long essay somebody had written about it. So you kind of read about the movie and the commentary about like what it's supposed to represent. Also, being the 90s, it was a little bit harder to kind of track these films down. Like this day and age, you're like, oh, you want to see The Godfather? Let's just download it, or you know, let's search for it online. Back in the 90s, yeah, it was harder to track down films, especially like before you got your driver's license or whatever. You know, once you had a driver's license, you could go to the video store. So yeah, that's why I spent so long being curious about this movie before I finally saw it. Then finally, it was on TV. I remember it was on TV, CBS or ABC or one of the big stations was showing it in two parts. So I was really excited to finally see this movie. I watched with commercials. It ended up being like 2 hours each time. I think the movie, if you see it without commercials, is only about 3 hours. Oh, yeah, by the way, sorry. I forgot to say this earlier. If you haven't seen this movie yet, go and watch it spoiler-free. Don't read anything about the plot. Don't watch my review because I'm going to spoil the plot. There is a lot of stuff that happens in this movie plot-wise. I mean, it's a famous movie with symbolism and gorgeous cinematography and all that. But there's also a lot that happens in the plot. So ideally, you want to watch a movie like this unspoiled. Don't do what I do. Just watch it unspoiled. Anyways, it was on TV, broken up into 2 segments. They could get away with this back in those days, because these were in the days where, you know, again, it was before you could download everything on the internet. You were kind of a little bit more held captive to TV schedules. So they showed the first 2 hours, and the first 2 hours ends right when Michael Corleone is going into the restaurant with the Turk and the corrupt police officer. And you know, of course, that he's got the gun hidden in the bathroom, but the scene hasn't played out yet, and then it cuts there, and then I had to wait like 1 week to find part 2. Of course, I already knew the plot because I had read it on the internet. Then I come back for week 2, and there was a football game that went overtime. So like it cuts in 45 minutes into it, with Michael Corleone already in Italy, and that you know, that whole assassination scene just got completely cut out. And it was, I think, several years later before I saw the whole movie uninterrupted. I've always kind of envied people who were able to kind of sit down and watch the whole 3-hour movie from beginning to end with no interruptions and without knowing what's going to happen through it. Because I would certainly imagine that's got to be a really intense viewing experience, because there are so many things that happen in the movie. And, you know, when you first sit down, you're not expecting any of that, right? Or I don't know. Is it predictable if you've never seen it? How much does this kind of catch you off guard? How much do you kind of see these things coming? But yeah, since then, whenever I find somebody who's never seen The Godfather, I'm like, oh, you have got to see this. Come on, sit down. We're going to watch it. Yeah, just because I'm very envious of kind of somebody who's kind of coming into it fresh and not knowing at all what to anticipate. Did this Friday night with the wife, actually. We've been meaning to kind of see it for months now, just because references to it have been popping up here and there. We'll watch a movie and it'll reference The Godfather, or there'll be a Marlon Brando impersonation. I'll be like, that's a reference to The Godfather. But yeah, then we finally saw it. Got interrupted a little bit by the baby crying, but was able to make it through kind of all 3 hours. And the wife said, "Are you going to do a review of this?" And I said, "No, because I've seen this a million times already. I just do reviews of the movies I'm seeing for the first time." And then I thought, actually, these video reviews are fairly painless to make. I just turn on the camera and ramble. And then I thought, I should really go through that list I made a couple years ago of my favorite movies of all time, and that's actually how this whole thing came to be. Yeah. Anyways, that's kind of my history on the movie. Thoughts on it? Yeah. Where to begin? Okay. I read somewhere, actually I've read this a couple times, that the novel on which it is based is actually not that great. I've never actually read the novel, so, correct me if I'm getting this wrong. But I've read in a couple places that the novel was actually just kind of a trashy, kind of supermarket paperback novel that they made into this epic movie. And I've seen this listed as an example of where the movie is much superior than the book. Actually, there are 3 examples which always seem to come up when you're reading about this. The Shining, the Stephen King novel changed into the Stanley Kubrick movie, The Godfather, and Gone with the Wind. In all 3 cases, I've never read the book. And Gone with the Wind, I've actually never even seen the movie either. I know it's a classic movie. I'm going to have to see that one day. But all 3 of these are kind of listed as examples of where the book wasn't actually that great, but maybe the movie is kind of what makes it into a classic. Sometimes Ben-Hur actually pops up on these types of lists as well. Even though in the case of Ben-Hur, the book is actually much, much older. Like, the book was written in the 19th century. But, you know, people say, okay, the book wasn't all that great, but it's the movie that really made it. And supposedly the reason in a lot of these cases why people even still read the book nowadays is just because the movie has epic status. Interestingly enough, I'm living in Vietnam here, and this book seems to be quite popular in Vietnam, in translation, like in the Vietnamese translation. But whenever I go into a bookstore here in Vietnam, I always see that book kind of featured prominently. So it's apparently at the moment enjoying some success in Vietnam. Yeah, I don't know. One of these days I should read the book just for the sake of reading it. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe this is fair, maybe this is not. But you can kind of get the sense when watching the movie that the bare bones of the story could easily be some sort of trashy mafia story that, you know. But then what's interesting with this movie is they took kind of this exploitive story with all these kind of, you know, cheap, no, I don't want to say cheap, but, you know, with a lot of kind of violence in it. And they just made it into this gorgeous movie. Now, I'm not much of a cinema guy. I can't really talk so much about the lighting or the camera shots or stuff like that. Other people can, and if you go on Wikipedia or if you search YouTube, you'll find a lot of film buffs kind of talking about like the gorgeous parts of this movie. I was just watching some of this before I shot this particular video, and I don't want to be the guy who just kind of regurgitates what he read on Wikipedia 5 minutes earlier. But there is a lot of stuff there about how all the lighting in this movie, how it was shot a lot in the dark, especially with Michael Corleone. His scenes, he was shot mostly in the light in the beginning of the movie, but then his scenes get more and more darker. There's also stuff about the camera angles. You know, apparently they made a real effort to kind of imitate the style of the 1940s with which this film takes place. So they don't do a lot of like crane shots, but just do a lot of like stationary camera shots. But I mean, that's just stuff I was just looking up just now. But even without being a cinema person, you can just tell somebody has put a lot of time and effort into getting these shots just right. I mean, you can tell that right from the first shot, where, you know, the guy is, that famous first scene where the guy is kind of asking the favor from the Godfather, and how there's a close-up of his face and it just kind of slowly pans out, and they just really take their time with it, and how you don't even see the Godfather, like you see the Godfather from behind for kind of the first few shots, then finally you see the Godfather's face. And that whole beginning scene with the wedding, it frustrated me a little bit the first time I saw this movie, because I was like, all right, come on, when is the plot going to kick in? Of course, I was young and impatient. I had the feeling if I had seen this movie when I was older, I would have appreciated just kind of how beautiful that whole wedding scene is, and how they're setting up the characters, and how the whole movie has this feeling of not being in a hurry at all. It's just like, yeah, we'll get there. You know, we've got a story to tell, but just enjoy hanging out with these characters first of all. Of course, now that I've seen the movie like 20 times, I no longer have the sense of impatience, because, you know, I know that the movie is going where it needs to go, and I can enjoy that first scene a lot more. But yeah, I mean, so many scenes like that. You know, that famous horsehead scene just builds up the tension beautifully, where you have, like, you know something bad's going to happen, but you don't know what it is. Then you have like the kind of scene from outside the house, and it's, I think like the first few scenes are just, the first few cuts, the shots are just really quiet, and then gradually the music is building up, and then you have the shot inside the house, and he's in the bed, and then, yeah, I mean, you've seen the movie, you know how that builds up. Another example of how you build up the tension beautifully is that whole restaurant scene with Michael Corleone, where it's building up to where he's going to shoot those two guys. And this is just, I mean, this is just classic. It's a perfect example of kind of Alfred Hitchcock reportedly said once, if you have a bomb that goes off, that's maybe 10 seconds of drama. But if you set up that there's a bomb under the table and it's ticking, then you get 20 minutes of drama out of it. This scene is like a perfect example of it, where you know that Michael Corleone is planning on shooting these two guys, but you don't know if he's actually going to have the guts to do it. And I mean, I don't need to explain this scene to you. You've seen it. You know how these guys are being really nice to him, and you think, is he still going to shoot them? It looks like he's getting along with them well. And then there are all these close-ups of his face where you can tell, like, he's thinking of something, but you don't know, is he going to get the guts to do it, or is he talking himself out of it? And then it's just classic the way they milk that tension. And very few films can do it. Quentin Tarantino has gotten a lot of praise for the way he builds drama in a scene. Deservedly so. He's brilliant at what he does. This movie was doing the same kind of thing years before Quentin Tarantino. I mean, all the way back in 1972, and it was just, they really just milked that scene for as long as they could, but it just works brilliantly. And then Michael Corleone, of course, goes to Italy, and that whole Italian scenery is gorgeous. So yeah, again, to reiterate what I've been saying all along, kind of a trashy mafia war story mixed in with just very excellent filmmaking. And it's kind of, I don't know if it's ironic maybe that such care and filmmaking was put into such a story about mafia, or maybe that's just, that's what you expect maybe. Like the Iliad is one of the most epic poems of all time, and it's all about violence. Maybe this fascination with violence just kind of runs through kind of all of human literature and kind of a lot of human filmmaking. Obviously, we're at the point now where mafia movies are a bit cliche. You're like, oh, geez, another mafia movie. And kind of the themes of the movies that they're making, or the points that they're making, have also gotten a little bit cliche at this point. I don't think that was quite as cliche in 1972. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. But the point that this movie is making, which is, I think, the point that every mafia movie has re-emphasized ever since then, is that these guys are just capitalists. They're businessmen. They're, sure, they're also assassins, and they're bloodthirsty, and they're cold-blooded. But you get the sense that the only difference between them, and the difference between like the CEOs of any major company, is that these guys are a little bit kind of less removed from the violence. Like, of course, the Godfather himself doesn't pull the trigger, although he did when in his younger days. Like, they all kind of came up through the ranks. That's something that comes out more in The Godfather 2, when you see his younger days. I'm not going to talk about The Godfather 2. Just too much stuff to get through as it is. Excuse me. But certainly, like, The Godfather is either directly giving the hits, or in the same room with the people who are carrying out the hits, with kind of CEOs of a major global company. I don't want to sound overly dramatic about this, but, a lot of these companies are not that far removed from people dying in certain cases. either kind of, you know, the indirectly through kind of worsening their health, like all the junk food and tobacco and alcohol companies. But, you know, there are also some of these companies have in the past had dealings with third world governments in which the government has kind of squashed dissent against the company. Look it up, right? Right? I mean, I don't want to go into all that just now. But, you know, and there yet, even though these companies do all these terrible things, these businessmen are never regarded as terrible people. You know, like the president of Coca-Cola or whatever. I don't know who he is, but, you know, I imagine he lives in a very nice house. He goes to very nice restaurants where people treat him with respect just because of all the money he has. And there's this sense in American society that if you have a lot of money, you must be a good citizen. You know, we kind of fall into that trap. Not just America, but just kind of all around the world, really. I've lived in another number of countries at this point. It's a global phenomenon. So the movie kind of plays with that, where you have these gangsters, and you know that they're doing terrible things, right? They're killing people, they're ordering assassinations, but then they drive around in these really nice cars, and, you know, they've all these people who are waiting on them. You know, that funeral scene when all these footmen are opening up the doors for them and escorting them out of their cars. And that money has bought them respectability, even though everybody knows kind of they're in the mafia. Because they have money, they're treated with respect. And, right, that's how America works. That's how the business world works. Now, something I had forgotten a little bit about, which I remember when I rewatched the movie the other night, is just how unsubtle all of this is. And I don't know whether that's a good point or a bad point. Some people like a bit more subtlety in their themes, but they are not being subtle about this at all. You know, there's that scene where they're all in that meeting and they're all kind of saying, I'm a businessman. And, you know, one character says at one point, of course we're not communists, you know, we expect to be compensated for this. And they all have a laugh. The other point where it's really on the nose is when Michael Corleone and his girlfriend, Kate is her name, right? They're walking along and Michael Corleone says, you know, my father is just like any other powerful man. He does what he needs to do. He's just like a senator or a congressman or a businessman. And his girlfriend says to him, oh, stop being so naive. Senators and businessmen don't have people killed. And then he just looks back at her and he says, now who's being naive? And I mean, I know it's on the nose, but yeah, it's just a great line, and it's just well delivered. The whole plot of this movie is fascinating, and again, arguably it came from like a trashy supermarket's tabloid book, or so people say. But, you know, there's certainly a lot of things that happen in it. Oh, sorry, if it's not clear, I'm transitioning to talking about the plot now. Where you start off, kind of everything's peaceful. Then you have the attempted assassination of Vito Corleone. Then you have Sonny kind of getting control of the family and Sonny just going nuts. Then you have Michael getting sucked into it. That Michael arc is, of course, one of the most fascinating arcs in cinema history, where he starts off with the movie wanting nothing to do with his family. No, I mean, that's not fair. He's still kind of loving his family, but he's very critical of them. And he says, you know, this is my family, Kate. This is not me. This is not who I want to be. And then by the end of the movie, of course, he's running the whole thing. You've all seen the movie. I don't need to tell you this. Something I had forgotten a little bit, which I remember when I rewatched the movie, is how quickly all of that happened. So he's He doesn't want anything to do with the family side of the business. Then he goes to visit his father. He's concerned about his father. He gets hit by the policeman. And then, boom, he wants in. He's like, yeah, I want to get these guys. And he's actually the one arguing with Sonny and Tom Hagen, who is saying, no, you can't kill a cop. He's like, no, we can do this. Now, it takes him like a few scenes later before he gets control, where he's in a point where he's in control of the family. But from that point on, it does kind of turn on a dime a little bit. There's not... I had kind of misremembered this a little bit, where I kind of misremembered it as a more gradual transition. But yeah, from that moment, he really is kind of all on board. Of course, then he goes to Italy and he kind of forgets about it for a while. But yeah, then when he comes back, he wants to get all in. The actors, right. Oh boy, the actors in this movie are brilliant. Marlon Brando, this is one of those things where I didn't know this for a long time until, like, I don't know, I looked it up on the internet one day or something like that. Marlon Brando was actually not that old when they filmed this movie. You know, he was in his 40s, right? Wasn't he? He was born in 1924. Okay, maybe he was in his late 40s. So he was not young, but he was not old. So they had to put like a lot of old age makeup on him and kind of all these prosthetics to make him look a lot older than he really was. And he just plays this part beautiful. Well, yeah. Again, we've all seen this movie. I don't need to sell you on this. James Caan as Sonny is just, yeah, I mean, he really steals the show. He dominates that movie for the whole kind of section of the part where he's in control. Robert Duvall, of course, is always brilliant. You know, he's got kind of a more subdued part to play. He doesn't get to ham it up quite as much as James Caan. And then, what's the name of the girl in that? Was just looking this up. Diane Keaton. Who plays the girlfriend, of course, is another famous actor. And Al Pacino, who wasn't famous before this movie, but of course has become terribly famous after this movie. Yeah, you know, we get so used to seeing Al Pacino now as an old guy in movies. It's really interesting to go back and see the young Al Pacino. But yeah, an unknown at the time they did this movie, but yeah, completely brilliant in it. Yeah, so it's interesting to see kind of all these famous actors kind of back in their prime, and they also just give really good performances of it. Yeah, what else do I want to say, really? I think that might be it. I'm sure I'm going to think of a million other things I want to say about this movie after I turn off the camera, but that's all I can think of for now. So anyways, brilliant movie, one of my favorite movies of all time. Yeah. In the video I made introducing this project, I did kind of say I was a little bit worried that some of my film choices were influenced by the critics. This one is one of those ones that was... I'm certainly influenced by the critics to a certain degree. This always consistently makes like the top 5 of film critics' lists of the greatest films of all time. Quite often it's number 1 on the list, depending which list you're looking at. I had a high school social studies teacher who was constantly praising how good this movie was to us. Oh, just a side note here. High school film teacher, social studies teacher, also used to talk about the Godfather Saga, which I never was able to track down, and I was finally able to look this up on Wikipedia. Apparently the Godfather Saga was like this television thing, where they took The Godfather 2 and The Godfather 1 and put them into one movie and put them in chronological order. because you know parts of The Godfather 2 are a flashback. And they also apparently took parts of The Godfather 1